welcome to Chore Chapters, because everyday tasks need good company. I'm Leo, and with me as always, we have got Luna.
Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Today we've got a thrilling and interesting story lined up, so grab your headphones and let's dive straight into the story.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling Chernobyl, a really significant and honestly quite harrowing event.
Absolutely. And we've pulled together quite a bit to look at it, some PBS frontline material, a History Channel FAQ, this really detailed PDF, 0 Hour at Chernobyl, plus Wikipedia, other bits and pieces online.
Yeah, quite a mix. Our mission really is to get past just the sequence of events. We want to understand the why behind it, the causes, the immediate chaos, and the effects that are still being felt.
Exactly. We're trying to pull out those key insights, make sense of it all for you so you can grasp what happened and why it's still so relevant without getting totally swamped in technical jargon.
Right, we're aiming for those aha moments.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's dive in. One thing that jumps out from the sources is this idea of a fatal combination of ignorance and complacency. It seems like a good place to start.
It really does. And what's quite striking is an early scientific assessment mentioned in that frontline piece.
Oh.
Their conclusion pretty early on was that the accident wasn't just about nuclear power having inherent problems. It pointed to really deep flaws in the Soviet political and administrative system itself.
So systemic failure right from the start.
Yeah.
That's a heavy thought.
It is. And the immediate trigger, it sounds almost mundane, doesn't it? A mismanaged electrical engineering experiment.
Yeah, the Frontline report really emphasizes that the engineers running it didn't fully grasp the reactor physics involved.
Their goal seemed simple enough on the surface. They wanted to see if the turbine, as it was spinning down after a shutdown, could generate enough power to keep the main water pumps going for a short while, just until the emergency generators kicked in.
A safety test, ironically.
Kinda, yeah. But connecting that to the wider picture, you see this push for getting things done, for solving problems, but maybe without the depth of understanding needed, or enough independent checks.
And Wikipedia adds a crucial detail here. The test was supposed to happen during the day.
Right. With a fully briefed crew, electrical engineers actually present a totally different setup.
But it got delayed. There was unexpected demand for electricity on the 25th of April, apparently. So the test got pushed late into the night, around 11 p.m.
And the 0 Hour PDF really highlights this consequence. The night shift took over, they were less familiar with the test parameters, and they were under the supervision of this deputy chief engineer, Dyatlov.
Dyatlov, right. And there's pressure, wasn't there? Pressure to just get it done, catch up on the schedule.
Definitely seems that way. And that's where the errors really started to cascade. It raises questions about the safety culture, schedule over caution.
Seems like it. So the operators made a big mistake early on. They reduced the reactor power way too fast.
Yeah, both Frontline and 0 Hour explain this. Dropping the power so quickly led to something called xenon poisoning in the core.
Xenon poisoning.
Think of it like the reactor getting clogged up. Xenon-135 is a byproduct of fission, and it strongly absorbs neutrons. So too much xenon builds up, and it starts to choke the nuclear reaction.
Okay, so the reaction is dying down too much, and they need to boost it back up for the test.
Exactly. And their way of doing that sounds, incredibly risky in hindsight. They started withdrawing control rods. A lot of them.
The control rods are the brakes, basically.
They absorb neutrons to slow or stop the reaction, so they pulled out most of the brakes to get the engine going again.
And did it work?
Not really. The 0 Hour PDF says even with most rods out, they couldn't get the power above about 30 megawatts, which, and this is critical, this was a super low power level.
Lower than intended.
Way lower, and actually prohibited by Chernobyl's own safety rules for continuous operation.
Why? Why was that level dangerous?
Because the RBMK reactor design becomes inherently unstable at very low power. It wasn't meant to run like that for extended periods. It's, like trying to drive a car on the highway stuck in first gear. Something's likely to go wrong.
This brings us right to the reactor itself, doesn't it? The RBMK 1000. That design seems central to the whole story.
Absolutely central. The sources, especially the 0 Hour PDF with its diagrams, lay out the specifics. You've got this huge graphite moderator.
Graphite slows down the neutrons for the reaction.
Precisely. Then you have pressure tubes holding the fuel rods, channels for the control rods to move up and down, and water flowing through as coolant.
Okay, and the really fatal feature was this thing called the positive void coefficient.
Yes, that's probably the most crucial design aspect to understand here. The PDF explains it well. In most water-cooled reactors, if the water gets too hot and turns into steam bubbles, voids, the reaction slows down.
Because steam isn't as good at slowing neutrons or absorbing them as water is, it's a kind of automatic safety brake.
Exactly. But in the RBMK, it was the opposite. The graphite was still doing the main job of slowing neutrons down. The water was mostly there as a coolant, but it also absorbed some neutrons.
Ah, I see. So if the water turned to steam...
You lose that neutron absorption from the water, but the graphite keeps working, so more neutrons become available to cause more fission. The reaction actually speeds up.
So boiling coolant made the reactor more reactive, not less.
Precisely. A positive feedback loop. And crucially, this instability, this positive void coefficient, was worst at those low power levels.
Below 20% power, where they ended up trying to run this test.
Exactly where they were. A design prone to running away, especially when operating outside its normal range.
And the problems didn't stop there, did they? The control rods themselves had a massive flaw.
A terrifying flaw, yeah. They were made of boron carbide, which is great for absorbing neutrons. That's the main part. But crucially, they had graphite tips, graphite displacers at the bottom.
Graphite tips, why?
To displace the water as the absorber section moved out, maintaining moderation. But think about what happens during an emergency shutdown, a scram. You drop all the rods in fast.
Okay.
For the first few seconds, as the rods descend, those graphite tips enter the bottom of the core first, pushing out the water there.
And since graphite is a moderator,
And better than the water it just displaced, it actually increased the rate of reaction, the reactivity in the lower part of the core for a few critical seconds.
it sped things up right when you hit the emergency brake.
Exactly, a positive scram effect. And the 0-hour PDF is really clear on this. The operators were not properly informed about this fundamental, incredibly dangerous aspect of the control system.
Wow. So hitting the emergency shutdown could, for a moment, make everything worse.
In that specific configuration, at low power, with many rods already withdrawn.
Yeah.
Yes, it was the final piece of the puzzle.
So you've got this volatile reactor design, especially at low power. You have an experiment being rushed by a less experienced crew.
It's a pressure.
And a primary safety system that could actually backfire catastrophically. It really does feel like a perfect storm.
It does. And the sources also shine a light on the people involved, the pressures they were under.
Yeah, tell us about them.
Well, the 0-hour PDF mentions Viktor Brukhanov, the plant director. He was apparently under huge pressure to meet production quotas set by the party.
Ah, the quotas.
Yeah. And get this. He'd actually signed off on commissioning Reactor 4, getting it started, without this specific safety test having been successfully completed earlier.
So the pressure was already there to cut corners, maybe.
It suggests that, doesn't it? Then there's Nikolai Fomin, the chief engineer. He was the one who approved going ahead with this turbine test.
Okay. And the supervisor on the night itself.
Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer. Sources describe him as having a pretty harsh authoritarian style. You did what he said, no questions asked.
That doesn't sound like an environment where people would feel comfortable raising safety concerns.
Probably not. It speaks volumes about the safety culture, or maybe the lack of one. A system where challenging authority, even if you saw a risk, might have been frowned upon or worse.
So under Dyatlov's command, the night shift pushed ahead with this test, even though the reactor was clearly becoming unstable.
That's the picture painted, setting the stage for what came next.
Let's walk through that final sequence. Wikipedia notes this shutdown procedure restarted around 11 p.m. on the 25th, after that long delay.
Right. And the less prepared night shift takes over, as 0-hour emphasizes.
Then the power just tanks, right? Plummets way below what they needed for the test.
Yeah, a huge drop. And then they struggled to get it back up. And in that struggle, they made more critical errors.
Like what?
The 0-hour PDF is quite detailed here. They actually disabled several key automatic safety systems.
Disabled them. Why?
Presumably because those systems were interfering with their attempts to manually raise the power. They were fighting the safety protocols to force the reactor into the state they wanted for the test, directly violating regulations.
So overriding the safety features on an already unstable reactor.
Precisely. And even in that precarious state, they decided to start the test.
And then the explosion.
Then the explosion. Around 1:23 a.m., early morning, April 26th, the first one.
What caused it?
0 Hour describes it as a massive steam explosion. The power surge was so rapid and intense it ruptured fuel channels, causing an instantaneous catastrophic pressure buildup.
And this blew the reactor apart.
It destroyed the reactor casing, blew the massive concrete lid, the upper biological shield, hundreds of tons right off the reactor building.
Just unbelievable power.
And it wasn't over. Just seconds later, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, there was a second, even bigger explosion.
What was that one?
Likely a hydrogen explosion. The extreme heat from the damaged core caused the zirconium cladding on the fuel rods to react with the steam.
Producing hydrogen gas.
Exactly. Highly flammable hydrogen gas, which then ignited in the air. The second blast was the one that really scattered the burning core material fuel, graphite everywhere.
And the control room, what did they register?
The logbook, documented in 0 Hour, apparently noted severe shocks, the control rods jammed, stopped moving, and then loss of power, just utter chaos.
The immediate aftermath must have been terrifying. Firefighters arrived quickly.
Very quickly, yes. But the 0 Hour account makes it clear they were running towards intense flames, a huge fire, but also into an invisible killer. Unimaginable levels of radiation.
Did they know? Did anyone grasp the radiation danger?
Initially, it seems not fully. It's heartbreaking to read about Alexander Akimov, the reactor crew chief.
What did he do?
Despite seeing graphite blocks strewn around, evidence the core had blown, he initially insisted the reactor itself was intact. He apparently dismissed the readings from his dosimeters showing lethal radiation levels.
Denial. Or just couldn't comprehend it.
Maybe a bit of both. Tragically, he and many of his crew received fatal doses in those first hours and died weeks later from acute radiation sickness.
And the danger spread, didn't it? The fire wasn't just in reactor 4.
No, burning graphite and fuel flung from the explosion landed on the roof of the adjacent reactor 3. It was coated in flammable bitumen, which caught fire.
Threatening another reactor.
A huge threat to its cooling systems. But incredibly, Chief Engineer Foman, the same one who approved the test, initially refused to shut down Reactor 3.
You didn't believe how bad it was.
Seems like it. A terrifying failure to grasp the reality of the situation unfolding right there.
Amidst all this failure, there were acts of incredible bravery, though.
Oh, absolutely. The first responders, the firefighters, guys like Lieutenant Pravik and Lieutenant Kibanok, they led the charge against the fires on the turbine hall roof and around the reactor building.
Knowing the risks.
Probably not the full extent of the radiation risk, no. Wikipedia mentions firefighters picking up pieces of graphite, feeling the heat, but not understanding the invisible danger. They received fatal doses very quickly, just unbelievable heroism and sacrifice.
So how did they even begin to contain this open burning reactor core?
It was a desperate, massive effort. Military helicopters played a huge role. The 0 Hour PDF details this aerial bombardment. Yeah, they flew sortie after sortie right over the exposed core, dropping tons of material. Over 5,000 metric tons in total over about 10 days.
What was it dropping?
A mixed sand, clay, boron carbide to absorb neutrons, dolomite, even lead, trying to smother the fire and absorb the radiation.
The helicopter crews must have been exposed to insane radiation levels.
Extremely high doses, yes. Another act of incredible bravery, really.
And then came the liquidators. That term has become synonymous with Chernobyl.
It has. This was a huge mobilization. Hundreds of thousands of people, soldiers, miners called into tunnel underneath the reactor, engineers, scientists, volunteers, drafted or volunteered for the cleanup.
What did they do?
Everything. Decontaminating buildings and land, building the sarcophagus, burying radioactive waste, often with totally inadequate protective gear.
The human cost must have been enormous.
Immense. The frontline piece touches on the scale. And 0 Hour includes this poignant testimony from someone whose father was a liquidator. How the initial pride and patriotism turned into devastating illness later on. It really brings home the personal sacrifice.
While all this was happening on the ground, this radioactive cloud was spreading.
A huge cloud. Released massive amounts of radioactivity. The sources estimate maybe 5% or more of the entire reactor core inventory got out.
Including what kind of materials?
Some really dangerous isotopes. Iodine-131, which is short-lived but concentrates in the thyroid gland, and longer-lasting ones like cesium-137 and strontium-90, which contaminate the environment for decades.
And the world found out. Not from the Soviets initially.
No, that's a key part of the story. Workers at a nuclear plant in Sweden detected abnormally high radiation levels on April 28th.
They thought it was their plant.
Initially, maybe,
Yeah.
but they quickly ruled out a leak from their own facility. They realized it was coming from somewhere else, carried by the wind. That set off international alarm bells. Finland also detected high levels around the same time.
So the Soviets were forced to admit something had happened?
Pretty much. Their first official announcement, also on April 28th, was incredibly vague. Wikipedia mentions it just spoke of a minor accident.
Downplaying it massively.
Hugely, followed by attempts to compare it to accidents in the U.S., like 3 Mile Island, and bizarrely, broadcasting classical music on the radio.
And they didn't cancel public events.
Not immediately. The big May Day parades, International Workers' Day, went ahead in Kyiv just days later, even as this invisible cloud was drifting over. It speaks volumes about secrecy and denial.
The fallout itself wasn't uniform, was it?
Not at all. It depended entirely on the weather patterns, wind, rain. Wikipedia describes how some areas far away, like parts of the Alps or Wales and Scotland, got hit with significant radioactive rainfall, creating localized hotspots.
And contamination got into the groundwater, too.
Yes, especially closer to the plant, a long-term problem.
Let's talk about the health consequences. The invisible enemy, radiation. What were the immediate effects?
Well, besides the 2 killed instantly by the explosions, Wikipedia confirms 28 first responders died from acute radiation sickness, ARS, within weeks or months. A truly horrific way to die.
And the longer-term effects. Cancer is always the big concern.
It is, and the most clearly documented link is thyroid cancer. Our sources are consistent on this. There was a huge spike in cases, especially among those who were children or adolescents at the time, in Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Russia.
Why thyroid cancer specifically?
Because of the radioactive iodine-131 released.
Yeah.
The thyroid gland absorbs iodine, so it got concentrated there. 0 Hour mentions estimates of around 20,000 cases diagnosed by 2015, with maybe 5,000 directly linked to Chernobyl.
Is it treatable?
Thankfully, yes. If caught early, thyroid cancer generally has a very good prognosis, but it still meant surgery, lifelong medication for many.
What about the liquidators? Did they see specific health issues?
Yes. Besides the ARS victims, Wikipedia notes a clear increase in cataracts among those who received higher radiation doses. Their eyes were directly affected.
But other types of cancer, leukemia, solid tumors, in the wider population, is there a clear link?
This is where it gets more complex and debated. According to the major scientific assessments cited in our sources, like reports from the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSCR,
Okay.
there hasn't been a clearly demonstrable increase in the overall rates of other cancers or cancer deaths in the general population that can be definitively attributed to Chernobyl radiation.
So, despite the fears, the massive cancer epidemic didn't materialize in the way some predicted.
Based on current scientific consensus, no. But that doesn't minimize the thyroid cancers or the suffering of the liquidators, and it's still a controversial area.
What about birth defects or hereditary effects, passed down through generations?
Similar findings there. Studies haven't shown a clear increase in birth defects or conditions like Down syndrome in the general population exposed. And a major 2021 study looked at the children of liquidators.
And found.
No evidence of transgenerational genetic effects, meaning the radiation exposure didn't seem to cause heritable mutations passed to their kids.
That's somewhat reassuring, I guess. But the psychological toll must have been huge.
Immense. This is often called one of the biggest public health impacts of Chernobyl. Widespread anxiety, stress, depression, PTSD. Among evacuees, people still living in contaminated areas, the liquidators.
Just the fear of the unseen.
Exactly. And Wikipedia raises an interesting point. The official designation of people as victims might have, maybe unintentionally, fostered a sense of helplessness and fatalism, contributing to poorer mental health outcomes.
That's complex. Okay, let's shift to the environment, the exclusion zone.
Right, the zona, a 30-kilometer radius around the plant, about 2,600 square kilometers, still largely uninhabitable because of long-lasting contamination.
Cesium-137, strontium-90.
Those are the main culprits now. They have half-lives of around 30 years, so they stick around.
And the red forest. That sounds ominous.
It was an area of pine forest right next to the plant that got hit with incredibly high radiation doses. The trees died quickly, turned reddish-brown, a very stark visual marker of the immediate impact.
But there's a strange twist to the exclusion zone story, isn't there? Wildlife.
Yeah, it's this weird paradox. With humans largely gone, wildlife has moved back in and, in many cases, thrived. Zero Hour mentions this. Wolves, deer, boar, lynx, even Prosolsky's horses reintroduced there.
So it's become a kind of contaminated nature reserve.
In a way, yes, nature reclaiming the land, despite the radiation. It raises fascinating questions about the long-term effects of radiation versus the impact of human activity on ecosystems.
But the contamination is still in that ecosystem.
Oh, absolutely. Radionuclides got into the soil, the water, the plants, and moved up the food chain, affecting forests, lakes, rivers.
And not just inside the zone.
No, the contamination spread. It got into mushrooms, berries, fish, even reindeer in Scandinavia, sheep in parts of the UK, impacting farming long after the accident. These pathways are really persistent.
The economic cost must have been astronomical, too.
Just staggering, and still ongoing. Hundreds of billions of dollars easily when you factor in everything. The immediate cleanup, building the shelters, resettling hundreds of thousands of people, healthcare costs, lost agricultural land, social benefits for affected populations.
Any specific figures?
Wikipedia mentions Belarus estimated its losses alone at $235 billion over 30 years. That's just one country. Vast areas of farmland and forest were just written off, unusable for decades.
And the impact on the communities left behind.
Huge demographic shifts. Many young, skilled people left the contaminated regions if they could, leading to economic stagnation, aging populations, a real blight on development.
There's also a political dimension, isn't there? Some argue Chernobyl hastened the end of the Soviet Union.
That argument is definitely out there, highlighted in Wikipedia. The idea is that the disaster and the botched response exposed the incompetence, the secrecy, the lies at the heart of the Soviet system. It shattered public trust and cost the state credibility and vast sums of money it couldn't afford.
And for Ukraine specifically.
Our sources suggest that for many Ukrainians, it became another trauma inflicted by Moscow, feeding into historical narratives of suffering under Russian or Soviet rule, sometimes even compared to the Holodomor famine.
Wow. Okay, so containing the reactor itself, they built the sarcophagus pretty quickly, right?
Yes, a heroic effort under terrible conditions. But it was always meant as a temporary fix, built in haste. It wasn't structurally sound for the long term, and it wasn't perfectly sealed.
So that led to the new safe confinement.
Exactly. That massive steel arch structure, a huge international project, sliding this gigantic hangar over the old sarcophagus. It was completed in 2016.
What's its purpose?
To safely contain the remains of Reactor 4 for at least 100 years, and crucially, to allow robotic equipment inside to eventually start dismantling the reactor and the old sarcophagus.
So decommissioning is the long-term goal.
Yes, for the whole site. Reactors 1, 2, and 3 were shut down eventually, the last one in 2000. But fully decommissioning Chernobyl, dealing with all the spent fuel and radioactive waste, that's a project that will take many more decades, maybe centuries.
Are there still major risks inside the remains of Reactor 4?
Oh, yes. There's the highly radioactive fuel-containing material, the corium lava, famously known as the elephant's foot. Its condition needs monitoring. There's radioactive dust. And a big worry is forest fires in the exclusion zone.
Why fires?
Because fires can potentially re-release radioactive contaminants trapped in the vegetation and soil back into the air, spreading them again. And continued international funding and cooperation are absolutely vital for managing all this safely.
So looking back at everything, what are the big lessons learned from Chernobyl?
Mhm.
It seems like a massive wake-up call.
A brutal wake-up call for the entire global nuclear industry, absolutely. Our sources really stress this. It exposed fundamental weaknesses in reactor design, in operating procedures, in safety culture, and definitely in international communication and cooperation.
And things changed afterwards.
Significantly, RBMK reactors still operating were modified improved control rods, faster shutdown systems, operator training was enhanced, safety regulations tightened globally.
Internationally.
The disaster led directly to stronger international agreements, like the Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident and the Convention on Nuclear Safety managed by the IAEA. More transparency, more sharing of information.
It really underlined the need for openness and accountability, didn't it?
Absolutely. And it showed that terrible duality of human response, systemic failure and complacency at the top, but incredible courage and sacrifice from individuals on the ground.
And the fact that the Soviets were slow to admit the design flaws, that hindered learning, didn't it?
Critically. If they had been open about the RBMK's problems earlier, maybe things could have been different. It delayed vital safety upgrades?
Are there still things we don't know for sure about Chernobyl? Lingering debates.
Definitely. Estimating the true long-term death toll is still debated, with projections varying widely depending on models used.
Like the LNT model.
Exactly. The linear no-threshold model, which assumes any dose of radiation carries some risk, is itself debated in the scientific community. Some argue low-level radiation might be less harmful than LNT predicts.
And getting reliable data must be hard.
Very hard, especially with all the political changes, the collapse of the Soviet Union, migration. Tracking health outcomes consistently over decades in those regions is a massive challenge. And, as we touched on, the long-term psychological impact is still a major concern.
So wrapping this up, Chernobyl was just incredibly complex, not just one cause.
No, a perfect storm, as you said earlier. Flawed design, yes, but also human error, bad decisions under pressure, a poor safety culture, and those deeper systemic issues within the Soviet state, all intersecting tragically.
And the consequences.
Yeah.
Health, environment, society, politics. Just immense and long-lasting, far beyond the initial explosion.
Absolutely. It left a permanent mark, changed how the world thinks about nuclear power and technological risk.
It really stands as this stark, enduring warning, doesn't it, about the risks we take with powerful technologies and the absolute need for a vigilant safety culture, for honesty, for international cooperation.
One source called the hard-learned lesson about the cost of lies, the gift of Chernobyl. A devastating gift, but perhaps a vital one.
It truly is. Which brings us to a final thought for you, listening. Our modern world relies more and more on incredibly complex systems, technological, financial, social.
So the question is, what are the potential Chernobyls lurking unseen within these systems? What are the hidden risks, the untested assumptions, the potential consequences we aren't fully considering?
And how do we make sure we have a safety culture that's genuinely vigilant? One that encourages people to speak up, to challenge, to prioritize safety over expediency. How do we avoid accumulating another different kind of debt to the truth, one that future generations might have to pay?
Thanks so much for listening, everyone. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us out. Until next time, take care and keep your chores company.